A passionate reading. Thank you, Scott. I know at least those of you who are gathered here in person were really hoping for an extra long word today so you can continue to enjoy this wonderfully air-conditioned space, so I've done my best to sort of extend my thoughts. But we do have a lot to say, so let's begin. I want to come right out and say it because you likely already know it. Your leadership has failed you. They have become warped by an obsession with legalism that belongs in the past. One which pursues some certain and severe interpretations of the law which harm those they are meant to protect. Though they claim to share our faith, these agitators pursue a life that Jesus would never recognize as honoring him, and by their limitations on your freedoms, they waste the gift that Christ lived and died to give us. These are just a few of the things that the Apostle Paul says to the church at Galatia in his letter to them, a section of which we just heard Scott read. The point at issue for those early Christians worshiping in the mountains of Anatolia seems to have been this. After Paul had established the church and then departed, a new group of leaders arose. And their guidance on theology and practice differed from Paul's in some really significant ways. Most prominently, this new group believed that Gentile or non-Jewish Christians needed to follow the Jewish law in its entirety, its prescribed dietary practices, as well as its other religious observances. If you're having trouble imagining what exactly this means, think for a second about what it would be like if a new Christian came into the church and the leader said, "This is wonderful, we're so glad you're here. You're totally welcome. But actually, before you come any farther, we're going to need you to put down that BLT and get circumcised." Not the best outreach strategy you can imagine. When Paul learns about this, he is aghast, because what he believed and taught was that Jesus' life and death shed light on a new way to relate to God, one that did not require adhering to the law. And in fact, Paul believed that the law was corrupt in a particular way, interpreted and applied such as it was by humans who tend to be kind of broken and imperfect. And there was just this small group left who was trying to remember what it was that Paul had taught them. And so he's writing to them, reminding them that in requiring new Christians to follow the old law, the Galatian insurgents were actually circumventing the liberating, equalizing, and affirming power of what Jesus had done. Now, I have to tell you that, as is true for many progressive folks, I'm not usually one to turn to the Apostle Paul for guidance on contemporary moral issues, certainly not those related to gender equity or marital power dynamics. In fact, I tread very carefully into the epistles these days because I am aware that some of Paul's most polemical writing, like that which you heard today, is the fulcrum on which rests many of the most damaging Christian arguments against women's autonomy, marriage equality, and freedom around gender identity and sexual orientation. Many times I find I don't agree with Paul at all, and in fact believe that his work is the antiquated and damaging moral code that is holding back people of faith from their most authentic and relevant proclamation. But even though I struggle with Paul and don't always agree with him, sometimes I can feel him. Paul's got a lot of feelings, and sometimes I can feel those feelings. I can track and join his passion and appreciate his unwavering obsession with something that he and I share, which is this idea that Jesus can be, for those who choose to follow him, a path to their own liberation and joy. And to me, that is the spirit of the gospel, and it's also the spirit of pride. It is the thing I feel I have learned from my friends and parishioners who are advocates for themselves and their rights as lesbians and gay folks and bisexual people and transgender men and women and gender non-binary individuals and intersex persons. As I have worshiped and fellowshipped and fought and paraded and marched and lived and died and cried and rejoiced together in community with these folks, I have witnessed in them a humbling and inspiring faith, a spirituality that insists on its own worth, even when almost everyone else is trying to legislate or limit it. I was thinking this week about my first ever Pride Parade. It was just days after I had graduated from seminary and been ordained, and I had been called to serve this little church outside Boston, the membership of which was very diverse and included a number of transgender people. And their first request of me as their pastor, before I even really started the job, was that I march with them in the Boston Pride Parade. And I felt a little nervous, strangely, just about being so public in my role because it was still so new. And also back then, it seemed just a little bit radical. Not really, but sort of. You know, at the time, there were so few PCUSA churches that had decided to be welcoming and said so out loud. And on top of that, we were just this tiny church, and there were only a handful of us that would be marching. And I remember thinking, is this really something to be proud of? But I had been called, and so I put on my new collared clergy shirt, stiff right out of the package, and I went down, and it was scorching hot, and we few souls got our banner together, and we marched through Back Bay and into downtown Boston. And along the way, something really beautiful happened. You know, first there was just so much joy. You know, it was kind of contagious as the celebration wound through the streets. I mean, who isn't going to be uplifted by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rainbows, right? There's something wrong with you if seeing 10,000 rainbows doesn't get you going in the morning. But the other thing that happened was that people began shouting to us from the sidewalks, "Thank you. God bless you. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Pastor. Great job. Happy Pride." And I found that as I marched on and heard all of these things, I sort of held my head up a little higher, and I sort of straightened my collar. And by the time I got to the end, I was beaming. Because on that day, I was able to inhabit my freedom and my identity and my calling and my faith in a new way, because of the way that I saw those things inhabited by other people who were there at the Pride Parade. And I found in that freedom more capacity to do my work loving others, particularly the flock that God had given to me in that call. Which I think is what Paul makes clear is the point of all this, right? Not being free to do whatever we want, but being free to love and to serve. Now, I have to tell you, if that was a high moment, I had some low moments this week. I don't know about the rest of you. When I read about the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, I cried. I cried for all the women out there who woke up the next day with fewer choices and more fear. I said this a few weeks ago. I cried for all the women out there whose lives will be meaningfully diminished by having fewer options available to them. All the women whose lives will be put at risk and cut short. All the women who will now cry into the night the words of the psalmist, "Protect me, O God, for I have none other." I cried for the medical providers who are now going to be fearful to offer support and guidance to their patients. And for pastors I know in other states who are called upon to tend to people in crisis and who will now experience the additional burden of fearing legal consequence for giving the support they believe to be most compassionate and just for their members. But mainly I cried because I fear that this decision represents a significant shift in the way that we think about human rights and dignity in this country. And I know we come from a lot of places on this issue, and that's okay. All are welcome here. But for me, this decision resounded as a profound declaration that women cannot be trusted to be free. That instead we need to follow this carefully prescribed set of laws to regulate our bodies and our behaviors. And it's even more scary because I know we are not alone in that. I know that there are other people whose bodies and whose behaviors some people would very much like to control. And many of those are my friends in the LGBTQI community, whose middle-of-the-night worries will now be more amplified as they wonder what's next for themselves and their families as citizens of this country. Are they coming for me? Are they coming for my marriage? Are they coming for my kids? Are they coming for my trans teens' gender-affirming care? These are questions that have been there all along, but which now rise with new urgency and agency. And though I know many across our nation greeted this week's developments with joy, to me, I can find nothing in it to be proud of. And I have despaired of that this week. I confess that. Do you know that sometimes pastors despair too? I had to dig down really deep to find any hope at all, to locate the wise counsel that the Psalms promise us is there beneath everything. But eventually, strangely, so unexpectedly, even for me, I found it in the Apostle Paul. Who knows, right? Spirit can be at work in strange ways. I found it in returning to the story which we had picked weeks ago to be one that we would read today, which emerges out of the murky past of the church's few years, when this little, insignificant band of faithful people had this strange idea that God's redemption could be for everyone. And so they got together, and they did certain things, and they sang songs, and they had communion, and they tried to remember what it was they were made for, which was for freedom, and for service, and for love. And I found hope rereading that account this week, remembering how easy it was for them to get distracted, and how easy it was for them to be filled with despair when the law wasn't on their side, and when their neighbors seemed to believe so differently than they. But also how it was their faith that helped them to endure. How it was their faith and the community formed around that faith that allowed them to set their sights higher than the present moment, that allowed themselves to cast their hope in a longer arc than that immediate moment of their despair. You know, in listening to these words from Galatians this week, I found a renewed sense of my own call when I considered how Paul was sent to be in communication with this church and draw them back to themselves, to say, wait, listen. You have to remember that this law is not who you are. This is not who God created and redeemed you to be. You are free, and you are beloved, and you are called to love and serve even when the tide is against you. And in hearing that, I realize I have responsibility to say some of those same things, to say some of them to you this morning, to the people of Rose City Park. And so listen to this. Wait. Listen. You have to remember that this law is not who you are. You are free, and you are beloved, and you are called to love and serve even when the tide is against you. Friends, we have a lot of work to do in the days ahead. I feel like I say that every week. We have a lot of work to do. We are again being summoned to enter into the struggle for justice and to raise our voices high. We have a lot of caretaking to do as we surround those who need it with our protection and our provision. We have prayers to offer and forgiveness to ask for and extend and healing that must begin. We have preaching to do, all of us, not just me, as we consider how to articulate a public Christian witness different from the one that is currently most operative in our culture. And we must continue to tend to the work of community building so that all can find a circle within which they find their worth and dignity affirmed as we work to protect those things for ourselves and for everyone. And I think the good news is the invitation the gospel gives us today, which is that we are meant to do this work with our heads held high. We are meant to know that at the edge of our consciousness rests a power that is profound and full of love for us and everyone. A power that wants us to have not only freedom, but fullness of joy in that freedom. And so our marching and our singing and our praying and our struggle, in all those things, God is present with us. God, who the psalmist promises us, never gives up or leaves us out. The one who is with us always on our path, bringing us into life and more life. And it's because we have so much work to do, we should start that now. And know that as we go forth from these words and go forth from this service, the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always goes with us. Amen.